Hi, Gerhard Bloom here, once again, looking at the tyranny and the delusions of the social justice movement. I'm a couple of days late here, looking at Juneteenth, right? This is June 19th, Juneteenth, and it's a holiday in commemoration of the freeing of the slaves. It was actually first kind of recognized as a date of importance to commemorate the occasion in which June 19th, when federal troops went into Texas, Galveston, Texas, and advised the troops, advised the slaves that they were free. And in principle, I have no deep problems with this. Although it must be said, we have Black History Month, we have Martin Luther King Day, and now, of course, we have Juneteenth. And this is a holiday that up until about 2 years ago, nobody ever heard of. And now deluded leftists are pretending they've honored this date for decades, something deeply held to their heart. And it's to remind us that slavery was bad. Yes, slavery was bad. But and there's always this promise that such dates and such commemorations are going to help heal the wound, right? Help heal the wound, bring it about, racial reconciliation. That's exactly false, right? All this does is serve to exacerbate tensions, and I see more and more of this sniveling, whining about reparations. As it happens, the American taxpayer has spent hundreds of billions of dollars in various funding programs, initiatives to alleviate the stresses and strains of the black community. Hundreds of billions of dollars. And now they want reparations. And you frequently hear the argument made, well, America was built on slavery. The American economy, America was built on slavery. This is absolute nonsense. Thomas Sowell looked at the evidence quite closely, and he looked at the American South, which was much poorer than the American North, right? The vast majority of slaves were in the American South, and it inhibited economic development. Yes, that's right. Slavery did not fuel the American economy. America did not grow upon slavery. Slaves did not build the United States. That doesn't mean slavery wasn't evil. Slavery is evil. It means that slavery did not fund the American economy. And in terms of distributing these reparations, right? Now, if you could find me a slave, I think that slave should get reparations. I think it was an absolute historical tragedy that the slaves, at the time of their emancipation, didn't receive reparations. They should have. But much like many of the tragedies in history, it can't be undone in the present. What's past is in the past. And the question further arises as to who is to pay and who is to receive. This is a problem because the majority of white Americans did not own slaves. This includes the southern states, the slave-owning states. The majority of whites there did not own slaves. And yes, there were a few, there were large numbers of slave holders, and many of whom were wealthy, but this wealth didn't spread across the economy, neither in the South nor in the North. And given that the vast majority of white Americans didn't own slaves, it's a problem. Why should they be providing funds? And there are no slaves or emancipated slaves living in the United States, and you're going to give them to the descendants of slavery. Well, this is a problem because you might not know this, but there were freed blacks that had slaves. That's right. There were freed blacks in the United States that held slaves. They didn't liberate the slaves and set them on their way. No, they owned black slaves. Blacks had slaves in the United States. And lest you think, before I forget, if you think the American economy was founded on slavery, ask yourself why Brazil, which had many more African slaves, its economy is nowhere near the economy of the United States, right? Nowhere near. And in terms of slavery, has the Arab world given reparations to the ancestors of Christian white slaves from Europe? Or perhaps you didn't know. There were actually more Christian white slaves in Muslim countries, predominantly in North Africa, than there were African slaves in the United States. And I don't see the Arab world looking to provide reparations to the descendants of white slaves. No, absolute nonsense. And furthermore, weren't we told that all of this looting that's been taking place is reparations? Yes, I've seen videos, mostly deluded white leftists, arguing that, this looting is reparations. In fact, there was a book by such a deluded idiot, I think In Praise of Looting. I may be mistaken on the title, but she was certainly an advocate of this view that looting was reparations. Utter nonsense. So, yes, slavery was bad. Everybody acknowledges it, except, of course, in the Muslim world where there are thousands and thousands of slaves today. You can go to slave markets in Africa and you can buy yourself a slave. And the Muslim world also had its black slaves. Why aren't the descendants of those slaves asking for reparations? Well, you might not know that the black slaves that were brought to the Muslim world were castrated. The males were castrated. So no, emancipation days, no calls for reparations from the descendants of those slaves because there aren't any. This is a reality. So, at some point we have to stop this nonsense and, this continuing narrative of oppression in the United States is simply wrong. Here's a surprising fact. When I started writing my book, I thought, the disparities and achievement gaps between blacks and whites was a legacy issue. This systemic racism, white privilege, that struck me as utter nonsense right from the beginning. But I kept an open mind. I was open to the evidence. And I thought that these achievement gaps must have been the legacy of racism. Well, here's some surprising facts, right? In 1960, 25% of children in the black community were born to single-parent families. Yeah, they were illegitimate. And yes, you can be illegitimate. It means you're a child that is born out of wedlock. That's illegitimacy, right? There's no crime in uttering that particular phrase. Now, in the black community, it's over 70%. So legacy of slavery? No, it cannot be. In fact, there were decades before the 1960s where the rate of intact marriages in the black family was slightly higher than the white, right? So less illegitimacy in the black community than in the white. They were virtually identical. And after the 1960s, it took right off, right? So 70%, nothing to do with a legacy of racism. Education, right? In 1860, 95% of blacks were illiterate in the United States. Right? This is no fault of blacks, no indictment of their intelligence. Quite the contrary, right? They were forbidden to get any education. So 1860, 95% illiterate. By 1910, that had dropped to 30%, right? 30%, which means 70% of the black community was literate, right? That's an extraordinary achievement. Think back to 1910, where racism was still rampant, the harshest, most unforgiving forms of discrimination and racial abuse, and the black community, 70% could read. Here's a jaw-dropping statistic. Now, today, 75% of black students in California can't read to grade level, cannot read to grade level. This is absolutely shameful, and this is all about the cultural commitments within the black community, particularly the inner city black community, and this was leftist policies. I've spoken of this previously, right? In the 1960s, you had people in the black community being seduced to go on welfare. This was leftist attempt to swamp the social welfare system of the United States, and they were actively encouraging blacks to go on welfare. Thomas Sowell has spoken very eloquently about this. In the most dire of circumstances, after emancipation, the black communities were poor. They were poor, but within the black community, you had the disreputable poor. It means shiftless, not working, prone to criminality, and you had the respectable poor. The 1960s comes along, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, right? Thomas Sowell remarks, it didn't take long before this hard-working, poor worker would look to his neighbors and see that they were making more on welfare than he was at his honest, respectable job. And it didn't take him long before his confidence eroded and he saw himself as a social dupe. This is shocking, and it had absolutely disastrous consequences. I believe it was in the 1940s, 1950s, where incomes in the white community and the black community were both rising. But what's interesting is black wealth was increasing faster than white wealth, right? So the gaps were narrowing. This Lyndon Johnson's The Great Society, the deluded leftists, just absolutely destroyed destroyed the inner city black community, and this self-pitying narrative is breeding resentment. Across the United States, the black community is being told that their poverty, their achievement gaps is a result of discrimination and systemic oppression. And I don't know if I mentioned, I did mention the disproportionate involvement in blacks in racial hate crimes, right? In addition to their vast disproportion in violent crimes, this is racial hate crime. And I've seen several of these videos. One incident, a black man has a rock in a sock, and he approaches a woman crossing the street, an Asian woman, swings this sock with the rock inside, hits her in the head. She falls to the ground as though she had been shot. She could have been killed. She could have easily been killed. In another incident, an angry black man kicks an elderly Asian woman to the ground in broad daylight, utterly unprovoked attack. Never met this woman before in his life. As she sits up, absolutely stunned from the attack, he soccer kicks her in the head and then proceeds to head stomp her. Now, these incidents are hardly isolated. We have to stop telling the black community that their failures are the result of oppression. They're not. It's a lie, and it is not helping the black community. It is harming the black community. And we need to be a little bit honest here about the facts. And nothing will change if we continue to feed this self-pitying narrative. It's utterly false, it's toxic, and it needs to stop. At any rate, if you doubt my honesty, take a look at my book, Deconstructing Social Justice. I go into this and other issues at length. It's scrupulously sourced. You don't believe me or my sources, you can ask Mr. Google and do some of your own research. And the book, no, it's not important because I wrote it. I wrote it because the issues are important. Thank you so much for your time. Please do drop a thumbs up.